I don't know where things broke down, but they did. Somewhere our modern world promised that technology would help us, connect us, but we're more divided than ever, and more alone. The American dream is that our children would be better off than we were, but we aren't even sure where we're going, let alone how to get our kids there. Where can we go for help? Where are we going to go to find wisdom in a world of cluttered voices? Is there any way we can get help? But what if there's a way forward through these problems? What if there are actual solutions for these modern issues? And the only thing it takes is for us to call for help.
Good morning. Good to see you guys. How are you? Oh, thanks. That's really sweet. Those of you who don't know why people are applauding, I don't really know why you're applauding. My name's Jay. It's because I'm familiar to some of you. My name's Jay, and I serve on staff at a church called Vintage Faith over the hill in Santa Cruz. I've been there for almost 3 years now. But for several years before I was on staff there, I was a part of the team here, actually. And so every time, it was my second time back since I left, and every time I come back, it feels like a sort of homecoming for me. So it's really great. Seriously, it's really great to see all of you. And I know we've got people watching online and at our various campuses. I wish I could be with you live in person, but I'm glad you're here, and I miss you guys all dearly. So thanks for coming. I really, truly am grateful and so glad that you're here. And I say that every time I get up to teach, wherever I teach, but I mean that in a really deep, visceral way today, especially because of what we're going to talk about. I am really glad that you are gathered here or gathered wherever you are gathered right now with other human beings. Because as the bumper video alludes to, we are in a series where for a few weeks we're discussing what the digital age, what technology is doing in terms of how it might be affecting the way we understand what it means to be the people of God, in many ways what it means to be human. And that's the idea I want to explore today. And to get into that idea, what I want to do is share a brief story from my life. Several months ago, almost a year ago, I had this very surreal, sobering experience. I was standing in my kitchen, and I had this moment that many of us have had that was incredibly sobering for me. Just a few moments earlier, I had snapped a photograph of my two young children. My daughter at the time was about 3, and our son was just a couple of months old. And I snapped this photo that was like one of those all-timers. So those of you who are parents, you know what I'm talking about, because when kids are that age, they don't cooperate very well. So to get a great photo of your kids together is really difficult. But I snapped one of those moments where my son was laying on a mat on the floor looking up at me smiling, and his sister, my daughter, was leaning over, hugging him, kissing him on the cheek. And I was able to pull out my phone and snap the photo in real time. And I was like, so happy with myself, right? And I was just like, this is it. This is my hit social media post of the year. This is gonna be so good. So I stood in the kitchen and I pulled out the photo on my phone and I'm just editing, right? Adding the right filter, trying different filters, the lighting, because you gotta nail it with these all-timers, right? You gotta really get it right. So I'm editing this photograph and I'm so immersed in making sure that this photo looks so great until I was snapped out of that moment as I felt this slight tug on my pant leg, and I had to look past my digital device of my digital image of my children to see one of my actual children, my daughter, tugging on my pant leg, and she captured my attention because she said the words, "No more email, Daddy, no more email." And it was sobering for so many reasons, but I wasn't on email. I was editing a photo of her and her brother. And yet what I realized in that moment was that in her 3 years of life, she has already experienced so regularly her dad being physically present, yet absent in every other sense of the word, usually immersed in email on his cell phone. She'd experienced that so often in her life that her assumption as she watched me on my phone was that once again I was ignoring her to check email. And I was heartbroken. You know, the writer Sherry Turkle in her book Alone Together, she writes this. She says, children have always competed for their parents' attention, but this generation has experienced something new. Previously, children had to deal with parents being off with work, friends, or each other. But today, children contend with parents who are physically close, tantalizingly so, but mentally elsewhere. This is the reality of the digital age, and I am so guilty of this. You know, shortly after this experience in the kitchen with my daughter, I was at lunch one day alone. And this restaurant where I was having lunch was right across the street from a local high school that has an open campus policy, meaning at lunchtime they let their students leave campus to go eat wherever they'd like and then come back for classes. And so shortly after I got to this restaurant and ordered my food and sat down to begin to eat, the campus let out and a bunch of high school students began streaming into the restaurant. And I decided in that moment, because I was actually checking email, I put my phone down and I decided for that lunch I was gonna people watch. And so I counted, actually, you guys. I counted 14 high school students who shuffled in groups of friends, and they ordered their food and they sat down. And I observed these 14 high school students. And here's what I observed over the 30 minutes that they were there for lunch. Out of the 14 high school students, 13 of them had cell phones in their hands the entirety of lunch. And the one student who didn't have a phone, I don't know if he got it taken away in class or his parents never got him a phone, I don't know. But that one student who didn't have a phone was shuffling from table to table to see what his friends were looking at on their phones. It's and I had this revelation, this thought in that moment, man, this is the digital age. This is the cultural moment in which we find ourselves. And the thought came to mind that these students, these 14 students, while they were able to communicate with the digital world, they were missing the opportunity to commune with the real life in the flesh people that they were surrounded by. Because of their smartphones, they were able to communicate digitally with whoever they wanted, and yet they were missing the all-important opportunity to actually commune with the real-life human beings in their midst. I'll talk more about the differences between the two in a moment. But this is the day and age in which we find ourselves. And so to begin, let's ask the question, how did we get here? See, it's really easy, and many people do this, it's really easy to criticize technology and to criticize tech companies. It's like, oh, we got here because of these companies that have created these devices and these new technologies. But I would push back on that. It's actually not about the technology itself. It's about us. It's about the ways in which we misuse and have misguided understandings about what technology is actually supposed to be. In fact, I would suggest to you that this has been a cyclical problem in human history since the very beginning of time. This is not just a digital age problem. This is a human problem in the ways in which we misuse technology. Let me show you an example. In the Bible, in the very first book of the library of books that we call the Bible, a book called Genesis, we read the story that many people call the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, let me set this up. In the opening pages of the Bible, in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, these first 11 chapters of the Bible in the book of Genesis, they tell us one overarching narrative. And the story of Genesis 1 through 11 is essentially the story of a good God who creates a good world for his glory and for human flourishing. But then human beings rebel against God and his plan for them. And the word Christians use for that is sin. Sin is human rebellion against God and his plan for the world. When sin enters the story, everything goes off the rails. And that's the story that Genesis 1 through 11 is trying to tell us. And in Genesis chapter 11, the culmination of this one long narrative, we read the story that many people call the story of the Tower of Babel. Let me read the story for you. Now, this story is about lots of things. We don't have time to get into all of the details, but one of the key elements of this story is the idea that technology, when it is misused for selfish ambition and selfish gain, it scatters us in destructive ways. Let me show you. This is Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. It says this: Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. And as people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Okay, let's take a moment and just go like verse by verse through this narrative. Let me show you how this ancient story that took place thousands of years before the internet and smartphones gives us a picture of the same destructive cycle that we are in today in the digital age. First, the story begins by telling us that the people, the whole world, had one language and a common speech. That's verse 1. The whole world had one language and a common speech. What that means is not only that they spoke the same language, in the original language, the statement actually infers that the people were united, that they were one people. So the story begins with people united as a community, as one people. But then in verse 2, the writer points to the fact that something wrong is about to happen. Now, it's very subtle. Verse 2 says, "As people moved eastward." Now, just a quick little aside here that's really important. Sometimes when you read the Bible, you'll read these random geographic statements, like people moved eastward, they went east. And we wonder to ourselves sometimes, why is that in there? Like east, west, north, south, doesn't matter. I don't know ancient Near Eastern geography. Why does that matter? Here's the deal. Again, Genesis 1 through 11 is one overarching narrative arc, right? I told you that. And I told you that in Genesis 3, humans rebel against God. This man named Adam and his wife Eve, they sin, they rebel against God. And then God actually, in response to their rebellion, in response to sin, if you guys know the story, God banishes them from the Garden of Eden, the place he had designed for humans to flourish. Does anybody who knows the story, does anybody remember which direction in which God banishes Adam and Eve? Anyone remember? East. He banishes them east of Eden. And so because of that, every time in the Bible you begin to read that people began moving eastward, the writer, more often than not, is winking at you like, "Oh, remember what happens when people go east." Eastward movement in the Bible almost always is intended to remind you, is intended to wink and to nod at you, to tell you as the reader something bad is about to go down. It symbolizes the fact that people are moving away from God and away from his plan for his glory and for their flourishing. And so in the Tower of Babel story, we see people who began united as a common people, as one people, and then the writer says, but they started moving east. They started moving away from God, away from God's plan for them. So you know that something bad is about to happen. And then in verse 3, it tells us they used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. This is emphatic technological language. brick was a technology of the day, a new technology. And so the people began united, they began moving east away from God's plan for them, away from God, and then they leveraged technology. And in the next verse, we're told why they leveraged the technology. Verse 4, they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Now, here's what's really fascinating. Almost all biblical scholars agree that this tower that the people were building was an ancient structure known as a ziggurat. Now, ziggurats were common in the ancient world. They were these tall tower structures, and at the top was a temple building. And ziggurats, their intention in the ancient world, they weren't just built by God's people. They were actually common structures in the pagan religious world of the ancient Near East. And ziggurats, their design was intended not for people to ascend and reach the heavens, but rather ziggurats were built with the intention of inviting the gods to descend and be with the people. And so what we see here is that the people moving away from God eastward leverage technology, build a structure that originally is intended to invite God to be with them, but instead they use technology to build this structure for their own selfish gain. Their own ambition drives them. Instead of wanting to build this tower to invite God to be with them, it says they build this tower to climb up, to ascend, and make a name for themselves. And then, this is what happens, verse 8. The Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. So let's just recap here. The people began in unity, and then their selfish ambition, their desire to make a name for themselves, leads them moving eastward away from God, and then they leverage technology. And that technology and their selfish ambition actually leads them to becoming a scattered people. They began unified, their ambition gets the best of them, they leverage technology, and where they once began united, they end up scattered. Does this sound familiar? This is the ethos of the digital age. We create things because we want to be more deeply connected. This is one of the dangers of digital technologies, is that digital technologies, social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever it might be, text messaging, all of these things, they masquerade as if they are uniting us. But spend a lot of time on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and spend a lot of time texting. And what you will eventually find is that in leveraging these technologies for selfish gain, we actually feel more disconnected than ever. The statistics bear this out. That as the digital age and digital technologies have gotten better and better, loneliness and isolation are both on the rise. The writer Sherry Turkle, who I mentioned earlier, she says this, that in the digital age, we began to think of ourselves as a tribe of one, loyal to our own party. So what's the remedy? What do we do? Particularly, what should the church do? What can the people of God do? I would suggest to you that in the digital age, one of the most important things we can do is to learn or relearn and embrace the art of gathering. To embrace the art of gathering. And I do not mean gathering online, although that can be helpful supplementally. I mean gathering the way we are gathered now, in a real room with real people in real time and in real space. Why? This is in your notes. It's because we can communicate in digital, but we can only commune in analog. We can communicate in digital, but we can only commune in analog. Now, these two words, communicate and commune, have such depth of meaning. Both of them do. We don't have time to get into all of them, so I am going to just try to summarize. And the summary will fall short, but I think it will give you a picture of what I intend to mean when I say we can communicate in digital, but we can only commune in analog. Here's just a gross summary of what I mean. To communicate, essentially, is to exchange information. But to commune is much deeper. Communing is actually the exchange of presence. And so, in other words, we can exchange information digitally, but we can only exchange our presence, our fully embodied, empathetic, compassionate, in the flesh presence in analog. We have to actually show up, actually gather, actually do the difficult work of meeting together to connect deeply and meaningfully with one another in order to experience the full transformative power of community. We have to do the hard work of actually showing up. And here's the deal, I get it. Showing up is not easy. For many of you here, many of you at South Hills or various places watching, it was not easy for you to show up. Those of you who have young kids, we have young kids, I get it. It is extremely difficult to show up. It takes a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of bribery of young children with snacks and, gummy bears and things like that to show up. I get it. It is hard to show up. And there's lots of reasons why it's difficult to show up in analog, in the flesh. But let me summarize it this way, and this is in your notes as well. Digital communities are much easier because digital communities are based on our preferences, and it is easy to choose and unchoose them. The digital communities I'm a part of on Facebook and on social media, on Instagram and Twitter, it is very easy for me to choose and unchoose and personalize the communities I'm a part of. If I get a friend request on Facebook and I don't actually want to be Facebook friends with that person, it is very easy for me to click delete on the request. If I'm on Twitter and somebody tweets at me on Twitter and I don't like what they have to say, it is very easy. It takes one push of one button for me to block that person and no longer be in digital community with that person. My social media feed is carefully curated by me to express my preferences. It is all built on my choice, who I choose and who I do not choose. However, analog communities are primarily based on who's there, and it's difficult to choose and unchoose them. Physical, real, analog communities to which we actually do the hard work of showing up are based simply, most of the time, on who's there. And it's really difficult to choose or unchoose them. I want you to think about the room that you are sitting in right now. And think about the people, the dozens or hundreds of people that you are surrounded by. Now, I want you to ask the question, how many of these people in this room right now did you personally choose to be here? How many of these people did you text or call or email and say, hey, I really want you to come to the 9 a.m. service or 9:30 a.m. service on Sunday? Like, how many? One? Maybe two? Some of you are pointing at your spouse. This guy, I invited this guy, made him come, right? Maybe a couple, maybe a handful. But there are hundreds of people here in this room at the Saratoga campus, and the reality is the overwhelming majority of the people in this room, you did not choose. In fact, here's the other thing. The overwhelming majority of the people in this room, you may not prefer. In fact, let's talk about this for a moment. You showed up today. Most of you, if not all of you, had no idea who's going to be up here talking. You didn't choose me. You didn't ask for me. You may not prefer me. Some of you right now are like, where's Steve? Who is this guy? I prefer Steve. I get it, but I prefer Steve too sometimes. But here's the thing. You don't prefer me. I may not prefer you. You did not choose me. I did not choose you. We did not choose each other. And yet here we are. And this is what analog community looks like. And this is exactly the way God intended. Because what God has been up to since the very beginning of time, he has always brought together the most unlikely people to become the one people of God together. Not because we prefer each other, not because we chose each other, not because of our choices at all, but because there is only one choice that matters in God's kingdom economy, and it is God's choice. It is the reality that God has chosen us. God chose you and you and you and you, and he chose me. And it is the only choice that matters. This is why analog communities gathering in real time, in real space, without our preferences, without our choices, but instead giving ourselves to the one choice that matters, the fact that God has chosen us. This is why it matters so deeply to continue to gather, despite our preferences, despite the choices we would or would not make. Because as we gather together, we are reminded that the most important choice, the only choice that matters, is that God has chosen us collectively together to be his people. This is how we change. This is how God intends to transform us together into his sons and daughters who bear light in a dark world. As we gather when the world scatters. You know, Jesus has been modeling this from the very beginning, since his earthly ministry. Let me show you. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 2-4, this is an obscure passage where the writer tells us about Jesus' disciples, the crew of young men that Jesus chooses to be his crew during his earthly ministry. And even more importantly, after his death and resurrection, these are the guys that Jesus calls to launch this, the Christian church. And it tells us this, Matthew 10, verses 2-4. It says, these are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, it's kind of an obscure, random passage, just a list of names, but you will notice that only two of the characters have these descriptors attached to them. Did you notice that? Everybody else is just their name or maybe like their family that they're from, who they're related to. But two characters in particular have these descriptors about like who they are and what they did. First, Matthew the tax collector. It's not just Matthew, but the writer tells us it's Matthew the tax collector. And then Simon the zealot. Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot. Here's why this is important. Jesus selects these young men to be a part of his group that's going to walk with him, live with him, learn from him, do as he does, and then eventually launch the Christian church. In the ancient Near Eastern world, in the first century Jewish world, if you can imagine the socio-political spectrum, on the two far ends of that spectrum would be tax collectors and zealots. Like the two groups of people in the ancient Jewish world who despised each other the most would have been tax collectors and zealots. Tax collectors were considered traitors to their own people. Zealots were people, they were called zealots because they were zealous to eradicate the wrongdoing of traitors, like tax collectors. During the time of Jesus, zealots were often arrested for physically harming and sometimes even murdering tax collectors. So when a tax collector and a zealot would have come across each other in the day and time of Jesus, they would have, like the tax collector would have run and the zealot would have wielded a sword. I I mean, that's the relationship between tax collectors and zealots. And yet when Jesus chooses the people that are going to become his people, his crew, the young men that he will call to together launch the Christian church, he chooses a tax collector and a zealot. This is not an accident. It's not random. It's not Jesus making a mistake. It's not Jesus being careless. It is hyper intentional. Jesus intends for the church to be launched by men who have no business being together. Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot should not have been together. They were so incredibly incompatible, and that is the very reason why Jesus gathers them together. Because he is trying to instill in them and collectively in us today that when you are a part of the family of God, it isn't about compatibility. The writer Brett McCracken, in his book Uncomfortable, he says this: commitment matters more than compatibility in the kingdom of God. To be a part of the people of God has little to nothing to do with compatibility. It is all about commitment. Here's the deal. In a room this size, if we were to spend just a few moments all publicly declaring our various worldviews or our political views or our philosophies on parenting or our philosophy on money, if we were all to share our opinions, we would very quickly realize that we are insanely incompatible. You are incompatible with most of the people in this room. You just need to know that. I am incompatible with most of you. There's no way that with this many people, we're all perfectly compatible. That's not why we're here. We are here as unlikely of a grouping of people as we are because we have experienced, again, the one choice, the one preference that matters, that God has chosen us. And so we gather in real time and in real space as real human beings in the flesh, in this analog community where we show up. We do the hard work of showing up, not because we chose each other, not because we prefer one another, but because we realize that collectively together, as incompatible as we may be, if we would commit to this community, God will transform us collectively into his people. That's why in the digital age, it matters so much that we relearn the art of gathering. I'm so grateful for the leadership team here at Westgate because they understand this. Many of you are part of life groups here, and I know the life group season is coming to an end, but Westgate wants to make sure that we continue creating space and opportunity for us to gather. And so I don't know if you've heard about this, but you guys know about the Meetups that are happening throughout the summer. Some of them have already happened. My friend David was sending me a photo of the backyard barbecue meetup that just happened, and it looked like there were a bunch of guys there. It was amazing. I kept asking him for food pics, and he wouldn't send them to me. He said all the food was gone. But it was amazing. It looked so awesome. There are all these meetups happening. If you're not aware of this, check your bulletin, and I know all the info is on the website because I went on the website and looked it up. And here's the deal. These are some of the meetups happening this summer. Hiking, surfing, golfing, kite flying, book club, burger bash, Warriors game watch party, Taco Tuesday. I don't even go to this church, but I'm probably gonna go to Taco Tuesday. San Francisco coffee crawl, bike riding, family park day, family picnic, backyard barbecue, watching Toy Story 4 together, kids play date and parent hangout, picnic dinner, swimming, board game night, San Jose Giants game, mommy and me walk in the park, ladies winery trip, ladies, right? I mean, think about this. This is an invitation to do the hard work of showing up because showing up matters. Listen, you can go on YouTube and watch videos of like the greatest hikes in the world. And you can know what the hike is like. And you can read descriptions of how many miles and how much elevation. You can be like a mental, intellectual expert on the greatest hikes in the world. But you can only actually hike with people when you show up. You can go on YouTube and watch like world-class kite flying videos. I don't know if that's a thing. I assume that it is, but you can, right? You can learn all there is to know about how to fly a kite as high and as far as you possibly can. But that pales in comparison to actually going out to the park and flying some kites with friends. You can go on YouTube and actually look up the greatest brisket recipe in the history of brisket making, like cooking, in the world, right? And get all the ingredients and all the cookware and all the methodologies. You can know everything there is to know about cooking the world's finest brisket, but you will still be hungry. Because the only way to satisfy your hunger is to show up. And I do not just mean your physical hunger. I mean the hunger of your soul to be known and to be human with other humans who you may not have chosen, who you may not prefer, but you were gathered because you understand collectively together that God has chosen you. And in showing up, you experience the transformation that can only happen in communities that gather together under the banner of Jesus. Several years ago, I spent some time as a youth pastor, and they were incredible years that I'm super grateful for. And every summer, we would take our high school students to a lake to wakeboard and to tube and to build community and to learn the way of Jesus together and to experience God together. It was like one of the highlights of youth ministry. And I remember one summer, we combined with another youth group in town, and we decided to go on this lake trip together. And so we had 150 high school students and leaders going up to this lake to spend a week together, wakeboarding and tubing and camping out and learning the way of Jesus and experiencing God together. So you can imagine just how big of an operation this was. We cooked all of our own meals, so you can imagine how many ice chests full of food we would have to take, along with all the tents and tubing and wakeboarding equipment and music equipment. It was just like crazy. So at this church, we had this old beat up box truck, this giant box truck, like from the early 80s. And so what we decided was we were gonna load that box truck with all of the equipment we would need. So the night before the trip, we gathered about a dozen leaders, and we spent 3 hours loading this box truck, literally loading it to the brim. Like it was completely packed. We were like Tetrising it in there. And so we load this giant box truck the night before. And the very next morning, we get together, 150 leaders and students. We all pray. We're like, man, Lord, give us an amazing trip. And then I, along with, I had a 19-year-old intern at the time named Brian, who's just this scrawny, skinny little 19-year-old intern. I said, Brian, you and I are gonna drive the box truck to the lake. And so I said goodbye to everybody. I said, we're gonna have to take it slow because it's an old beater box truck. So we'll leave early so we get there at the same time as you. So Brian and I get into this box truck. We start driving. The lake is about 3 hours away. And the first hour is great, but then about an hour into the drive, smoke begins to billow from the engine. And we're like, oh, no. So we pull off to the side of the freeway, and I look at my intern, Brian. He's 19. He doesn't know left from right. He's looking at me like, what do we do, right? Such desperation. And I'm trying to be the mature, confident adult in this situation. And I'm like, it's all right, man. And then I look out the other side away from him and just start weeping. I begin contemplating, should I just get out of this truck and run for Mexico and never show up? That sounds like, like a better option at this point. But I finally gather myself. I call a tow, and the tow arrives about an hour later, tows us to the mechanic, and I'm relieved. Like, okay, the mechanic's got it. He's gonna fix it. Maybe an hour or two, we'll be back on the road. And so there was a diner right across the street from the mechanic. So me and Brian go to the diner, sit down, order so much food just to comfort ourselves. And right as the food is coming out, like the steaks and the onion rings, literally as the waiter is bringing the food, I get a call on my phone, and it's the mechanic. And the mechanic says, hey man, I'm gonna be able to fix your truck. I'm like, great. It's like, but it's an old truck and I don't have the parts on hand, so I'm gonna have to order them. It's gonna take a little while. And I'm thinking like maybe a couple extra hours, and like, how long? He goes, well, I could probably get it done by Friday. This was Sunday. Our trip was supposed to end on Friday. So at that point, I'm just thinking, everyone's gonna be dead with no food and water until Friday. That's not gonna work. So I start panicking, freaking out. Again, I gather myself. I look up a local U-Haul. I ask the mechanic to drive me to the U-Haul so I can rent a U-Haul truck. But before I go to the U-Haul, I look at my scrawny 19-year-old intern, Brian, and I say, Brian, while I go get this U-Haul, I need you, this sounds so crazy, but I need you to try to unload as much of this box truck as possible and just lay it out on the parking lot. And he looks at me again, he's like, okay. And he gets into the box truck and he starts going. I go, takes me about half an hour to get the U-Haul. We come back and I see Brian, he has his shirt off and he's sweating and he's bleeding, but he's got half the truck. He has half the box truck unloaded. Now it's not, he hasn't done a good job. It's just laid out everywhere on the parking lot, but he has half the truck unloaded. I was so inspired by his effort. I got out of the truck and was like, great job, man. And I roll up my sleeves and I jump into the truck with him. In 1 hour total, we unloaded a box truck and reloaded it into the U-Haul in 1 hour. Something that took 12 liters, 3 hours to do, we pulled off in an hour. Now, it was a hot mess. Everything was spilling and falling everywhere. We left a lot of non-essentials behind, but it doesn't matter. We got what we needed and we loaded that truck and we shut the door and we got into the U-Haul and we started driving to the lake. And 2 hours later, from the highway, we could see the lake off in the distance. And I'm looking at the lake and from the corner of my eye, I see Brian in the passenger seat shaking and trembling. And I look at him carefully and I ask him, Brian, are you crying? And he says to me, yes. I didn't think we were gonna make it. He's just weeping. And so then, this is embarrassing to share, you guys, but I started weeping. And so here we are, we're just both crying. And then we pull up and everyone's like cheering as we pulled up. It was like a movie. And we got out of the truck and everyone starts unloading and me and Brian just hug and we're weeping and everyone's staring at us like, what's wrong with them? We're like, we're just crying. Now that's embarrassing and it's funny, but that's because you weren't there. Right? I mean, think about that. Because sometimes the power, the transformative power of experiences like that, you just have to show up. You have to be there. You can't possibly understand what it's like to sweat that much, to bleed that much, to persevere that much, to doubt that much, and to watch God come through that much together unless you show up. And so that's my invitation. Continue to show up so that God might transform you together into the people he's intended for you to be since the very beginning. In a moment, we're going to sing and respond, and we're going to take communion, the bread and the cup, which reminds us of the fact that God could have rescued us and saved us a million different ways, but the way he chose was to send his son, who actually showed up in the flesh for us. Communion, which reminds us that God could have given us a million different ways to remember his great sacrifice, but the way he gave us was to show up over a meal, the bread and the cup, to eat and drink together. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. God, we're grateful for the way in which you showed up and the way in which you continue to show up in our lives today. And we ask today that you would empower us, strengthen us, give us the courage and conviction to continue showing up in flesh, in real time and in real space, so that collectively, together, you might transform us into the people you've called us to be. We love you. We pray these things in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen.